Let's go to our search component. The search component should be responsible for this input field, where we, for example, can enter apples, and then we only see, well, the items that match this name. And we're doing a full name search here, so we'll not search for app, but apples gives us all apples, bananas gives us all bananas. That's the idea here. Right now this doesn't work, of course, because the search.js file is pretty empty and has no meaningful logic in there. It's time to now change this with the knowledge we gained thus far. First of all, let's make sure we manage the user input. So we can, add an import to use state here, like that. And then here again use array destructuring to have the entered filter, let's say, and set entered filter. And then use state with an empty string and bind this down there, bind the value to entered filter, and bind on change here to a function that updates set entered filter. We get the event automatically passed in by React in the end. And then we call set entered filter and we set this to event target value. So that's something we did before already. It's just saving the value here. But now the idea is that whenever a user types something here, we try to fetch filtered data from Firebase. How could we make this work? Well, you could register a function for onChange, which basically sends a HTTP request on every keystroke. Would work. Here, however, I'm updating the saved value on every keystroke, and instead what we can do is we can use useeffect here, add it here, and pass in a function that should make that HTTP request. And we simply specify entered filter as a dependency. And this means this function will execute whenever entered filter changed. So it's having the same result, but in my opinion, it's a bit more elegant because we're really embracing the idea of hooks here. We're splitting our logic. This function only updates what the user entered, or only updates the state where we store what the user entered. And then useeffect will automatically execute thereafter and do whatever we want to do for every change. So here I want to send a HTTP request. So I'll go to ingredients.js and basically fetch the logic I have in here for fetching the requests. So let's grab that, copy it, and add it here into useeffect. URL is the same, transformation is the same, but of course in the end I don't call set user ingredients, but instead I want to trigger something in ingredients.js, right? Because that is where we manage our ingredients. That is where we also use the search component. So in the end, we should establish a connection between search and this ingredients component to update the ingredients here whenever we fetch new ingredients in search.js, let's say. Now, of course, typically for that, we would use props. So we can specify, let's say, props onload ingredients. Name is totally up to you. Call this as a function and forward our loaded ingredients like this. So onload ingredients is now a function I expect on my search components. So in the ingredients component, we have to specify this prop on the search component and there forward a pointer at a function that should execute when onload ingredients is called in the search component. We have no such function yet, so let me add a new one, maybe here at the very top. I'll name this filtered ingredients handler or whatever you want to call it. We get our filtered ingredients or whatever you want to call that as an argument. And the idea here is simply that we call set user ingredients and we set this equal to our filtered ingredients because these should already be in the right format. So a very simple function, and I'm passing a pointer at this function to onload ingredients on the search component so that we can call this function from inside the search component. So now back in the search component, we're calling this. Now with that, we have an effect that runs whenever entered filter changes, but now here we're getting a warning. In the end, the problem is that we're relying on props here, but we haven't specified them as a dependency. And that means that if props changed, this component will re-render, but this effect won't rerun because we haven't informed the effect about the fact that props are a dependency. Now you might say, well, I'm only pointing at a function here. That function shouldn't change. So actually that shouldn't rerun if props change. Well, you should never cheat regarding your dependencies. It's a good practice to always be clear about all dependencies you have. And here, props is a dependency, but still we'll have a problem with that. Now this effect will rerun whenever props change. That basically is the case whenever anything passed to this component here changes, or whenever anything in the parent component changes. That's also not what we want. We only want to rerun this function if onload ingredients, so if this function we're pointing at, if that changed. And for that, we can use another modern JavaScript syntax, maybe right here at the very top. We saw array destructuring. There also is a concept called object destructuring. Works in a very similar way. We have curly braces in this case on the left side of the equal sign. On the right side, we have the object, which we want to destructure, or from which we want to extract properties. And then here between the curly braces on the left side, you specify the names of the keys in that object, which you want to extract and which you want to store in separate variables. So in my case here, that would be onload ingredients. I know that this will exist as a key in props. I'm calling it here. And now I'm simply pulling that out and storing it in a separate onload ingredients constant. So this is now a separate constant. And here we can just call onload ingredients. And we can specify onload ingredients as a dependency now. And now this will only rerun this effect if exactly this value changed. So if anything else in props changed, this will not rerun. Only if this function changed or if the entered filter changed. In these cases, we'll send a request here. And this request will get our data, then call onload ingredients in the end, and that should set our ingredients here. Now, our request right now, however, is not taking the entered filter into account. It's fetching all ingredients. Of course, it should fetch filtered ingredients instead. Thankfully, Firebase supports filtering. We can append some query params, which I'll store in a separate variable here, to the end of this URL. And I want to have different query params depending on whether we entered something or not. So if entered filter length is equal to 0, then my query param will be nothing. I'll not add any query parameters. So it's just an empty string. Otherwise, it'll be a string for which I use backticks here. So these are not single quotes, but backticks, so that we can use string interpolation to dynamically inject values here. And then you should add question mark order by, written like that, equal double quotes, opening and closing, and between the double quotes, the field for which you want to filter. In our case, that's the title field. Then ampersand equal to, written like that, equal sign, double quotes, opening and closing. And now with string interpolation, which is done with $sign and then opening and closing curly brace, the value entered in entered filter. This sets up query, which is either an empty string or this string here. And this is simply a syntax, a combination of query params understood by Firebase to in the end filter the title field for the value entered here. We have to append this at the end of our request here. So we can simply add plus query here in the end. And that's either that empty string or that valid query setup. Now to make this work, we need to also make a tiny adjustment here on Firebase. Go to rules in your database. Now we need to add an entry here to unlock filtering. Add double quotes here after this read-write thing. And there add ingredients. So basically the name you have as a node here you're sending your data to. Ingredients. And then the value is another object in the end with opening and closing curly braces. And in there add another string with double quotes. Dot index on, which is a command understood by Firebase. And then this is an array, again with a string value in there, which is basically the field name by which you want to be able to filter. So you need to add this setup here to your Firebase rules. With this setup, we can filter for the title. Now we can send requests here. Now a request should be sent whenever we type something here. So let's now save that. Go back to our app. And you see, oh, we seem to be in an infinite loop again here. So to leave it, let's comment out onload ingredients and save this and reload. What's causing this infinite loop?